Edward Isty was a remarkable monarch. He initiated the 100 Years' War and achieved many victories on the battlefield. He also reformed the feudal system of England, restoring the title of Duke to members of the royal family and granting it to all 5 of his sons. Edward concentrated power in himself, and as soon as he died, the system he had built began to crumble. The Wars of the Roses are thought to have begun in 1455, though the underlying conflict between the York and Lancaster dynasties can be traced back to the death of Edward II in 1377. The first son, Edward the Black Prince, was supposed to inherit the power, but he died before his father. Even so, the crown did not pass to another son of Edward I, but instead to his grandson. Richard II, the son of the Black Prince, became king at just 10 years old. The Council of Regents for the young king was led by Edward VI's third son, John of Gaunt. He already had experience in governance as he had managed the kingdom while his father was ill, and continued to do so during Richard II's reign. It is important to note that it was John of Gaunt who inherited Lancaster through marriage, making him the first Duke of Lancaster. His illegitimate son John became the Earl of Somerset. Together, they would become crucial supporters of the Lancasters in the upcoming war. Richard II proved to be an inept king. He was easily swayed and thoughtlessly granted titles. Revolts began to rise against him, including the Peasants' Revolt, as well as the Lords' Appellants' Rising. In the Lords' Appellants' Rising, the king's cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, participated. Later, Richard exiled him from the country and disinherited him after his father's death. That same year, the king went to fight in Ireland. This futile endeavor became the perfect opportunity for Henry Bolingbroke to return home and raise a rebellion. On his way to London, he was supposed to be stopped by his uncle, Edmund of Langley, the fourth son of Edward III and the first Duke of York, who had founded the dynasty by inheriting the relevant lands. As a representative of one of the wealthiest families in England, Edmund decided that he would strengthen his position even further by siding with Henry and abandoning the king. Together with his son Edward of Norwich, who commanded Richard's forces, they avoided battle and switched allegiance to Bolingbroke. The Yorks and Lancasters united as the most powerful dynasties in England, and for the first time, the throne was held by a Lancaster, Henry IV. His first order was to imprison the old king, where he is believed to have died, starved to death. Naturally, in the eyes of some English lords, Henry appeared to be a common usurper. In the very first year of his reign, a group of 4 earls conspired to kill the king at a tournament and restore the then still living Richard II to the throne. Henry was saved by his cousin, Edward of Norwich, who initially participated in the conspiracy, but later revealed the names of all the traitors. That same year, the Welsh, led by Owen Glendower, revolted against the English. This uprising lasted for 15 years and was only suppressed by the next king and son of the previous one, Henry V. With a numerical advantage and by reconciling with some Welsh lords, he regained control of Wales. Nonetheless, by using French support for the Welsh rebels as a pretext, he reignited the 100 Years' War. Lords also conspired against Henry V, planning to kill the king on his way to France and place Edmund Mortimer, another descendant of Edward VI, but through his mother's line, on the throne. The conspiracy was uncovered in Southampton. The conspirators, including Richard Cambridge, the younger brother of the Duke of York, Edward of Norwich, were sentenced to death. Meanwhile, Henry V was achieving victories in the 100 Years' War. He quickly defeated the French and captured Paris. According to the peace treaty, Henry was to inherit the French crown from King Charles V the Mad. To secure this, he married his daughter, Catherine of Valois. This played a cruel trick on the Lancasters, as Henry's son, The future King Henry VI inherited madness from his French grandfather. There was another grim piece of news for the Lancasters. Edward of Norwich, who died childless at the Battle of Agincourt, left the title of Duke of York to his nephew Richard, the son of the very Earl of Cambridge whom the king had recently executed. Richard York acquired significant holdings. In addition to his inheritance from his father's line, he also inherited the Mortimer estates from his mother, along with the rights to the throne, as two of his ancestors were sons of King Edward I. Becoming the richest and one of the most influential lords in England, Richard lacked only the authority of a military leader. As he grew up, he began to earn his reputation, and quite successfully. Starting in 1436, Richard took command of English forces in France. Henry VI of the Lancaster dynasty became king when he was less than a year old. Thus, a regency council ruled in his place during his early years, with its members constantly squabbling. When Henry VI grew up, he never became a strong monarch and married the influential Margaret of Anjou. The Queen effectively took control of the governance. France. She faced two main problems. First, she was French, and the English were still engaged in the 100 Years' War with France. Second, her power relied on William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, men loyal to the Queen but inept military leaders. At the end of 1446, Beaufort displaced Richard York from his position and immediately suffered several defeats, significantly reducing English holdings on the continent. Meanwhile, Richard, who was popular among the soldiers, was sent to oversee yet another conquest in Ireland, which was effectively an honorable exile for him. Naturally, neither Margaret nor her favorites won the affection of the English. They were accused of betraying England and intentionally suffering defeats for the benefit of France. Internal problems also mounted. Officials borrowed so aggressively in the name of the feeble king that by 1450, the English crown's debt was 12 times the annual budget. High taxes and widespread corruption further diminished the popularity of the royal authority. Unrest began to escalate when the Queen's favorite, William de la Pole, was captured at sea on his way to France and killed. That summer, a rebellion led by Jack Cade erupted in southern England. The rebels demanded the removal of the Queen from power, the return of the Duke of York to command the army, and punishment for the incompetent commanders responsible for their defeats in France. By September 1450, Richard York had returned to England and settled with his troops in the vicinity of London. At the same time, Edmund Beaufort lost Normandy after the Battle of Formigny. The outrage over his defeat was so strong that when he returned to England, he was forced to hide in the Tower from an angry mob that burned his house. Amidst this, Richard York's popularity continued to rise. He returned to his ancestral lands, gathered his supporters, and a year later set out on another march toward London. This turned out to be a mistake, as Lancaster supporters also gathered forces outside the city walls. Instead of successfully seizing the capital, Richard had to swear allegiance to the king. In 1453, following news of a defeat in France, Henry VI's illness worsened. Richard York, a favorite among the soldiers, was appointed Lord Protector. Taking advantage of his new power, he imprisoned Edmund Beaufort, removed unpopular officials, and finally paid the long overdue wages to the soldiers stationed in Calais. For this, though, he had to borrow money in his own name. The York family experienced significant loss of life throughout this entire conflict. It's crucial to acknowledge the major shifts happening in England during this period. The general populace in England felt unhappy about losing battles in France. Conversely, the powerful landowning nobles greatly increased their military forces. Armies used to be exclusively composed of knights who swore loyalty, usually numbering in the hundreds, but now soldiers who had fought for many years in France were returning. These fighters, reluctant to go back to civilian life, were available for hire by the nobles. Lesser knights, possessing estates only in French territories they had conquered and holding no status in England, also joined the ranks of hired soldiers. Furthermore, the mercenary forces were augmented by various younger sons or illegitimate children of nobles who had no expectation of inheriting their father's property. These developments were what enabled the Yorks, Lancasters, and other aristocratic families to gather thousands of fighters for their campaigns. While previously, dukes had only fantasized about fighting each other, they now possessed the resources to realize those desires. In that same year, 1453, the Percies, allied with the Lancasters and the Nevilles, who supported the Yorks, initiated a conflict between them over territorial disagreements. It became evident throughout England that both sides of this dispute were prepared for combat, and lasting peace within the realm seemed unlikely. Within London, two distinct political groups eventually materialized. Later on, William Shakespeare would distinguish them by their respective rose colors. The white rose symbolized those who sided with York, whereas the red rose represented Lancaster supporters, thus giving the war its name. Despite this version seeming unlikely, scholars find it more engaging than purely academic descriptions. In reality, these factions selected their symbols based on their family crests. In Yorkshire, the white rose was indeed prevalent in decorative items and featured in Yorkist imagery, but it wasn't the primary emblem. The red rose of the Lancasters did not exist during that time. It's probable that Shakespeare created the red rose symbol merely to explain the origin of the Tudor dynasty's white and red roses. Some propose that the Lancastrian symbol was a swan depicted on their livery, but this was only worn by knights associated with the Queen's personal estates, indicating their allegiance to her. In 1455, King Henry VI regained his health. Richard, Duke of York, once again lost his position of influence. Edmund Beaufort was released from imprisonment in the Tower and took charge of the Lancastrian forces. Around this time, whispers spread through England suggesting Edmund was the Queen's paramour, and that Prince Edward, born a year before, was actually Beaufort's child. Reacting to this situation, the Lancasters amassed an army of 2,000 soldiers under Beaufort's command and marched north. York also rallied his followers, among whom the most significant was Richard Neville, the Earl of Salisbury. Exploiting Beaufort's disadvantage, the Yorkists cornered his forces near St. Albans. The Lancastrian army didn't even suffer a defeat in battle. They dispersed due to the demise of their leader. King Henry VI was taken captive. After proceeding to London, Richard York assumed control. Furthermore, he was positioned to inherit the throne upon Henry's passing, which seemed imminent given the king's precarious health. In response, Queen Margaret relocated to Coventry, where she continued to gather support. The Lancastrian military command then fell to Edmund's son, Henry Beaufort. By 1458, the opposing sides formally reached an agreement at St. Cathedral, yet the hostilities did not truly cease. When Richard Neville, the younger Earl of Warwick, returned to England, an attempt was made on his life in Westminster. The Earl narrowly avoided death, and suspicion for the assassination attempt fell upon the Queen. Margaret decided to exploit this development. Knowing that no Yorkists would travel to Coventry, she convened a parliament that declared York and all his adherents enemies of England. This time, Richard York organized two armies, one in the north led by Richard Neville, and another in the west under his own command. The Queen attempted to prevent the unification of these two armies, but the Lancastrian forces were once again led not by experienced military commanders, but by loyal nobles devoted to the Queen. Consequently, at the Battle of Blore Heath, the Lancasters experienced another defeat. Even after his defeat at Ludford Bridge and subsequent escape from England, Richard York remained determined to continue the war. He maintained his supporters and returned to England a year later, once again assembling troops. Meanwhile, the Nevilles not only secured the southern coastline, but also captured the king for a second time. Duke York once again took control of London, proclaimed himself the rightful heir to the throne, and effectively seized all governing authority. He then advanced northward to neutralize the remaining Lancastrian forces. At this juncture, the Queen was in Scotland, where she was enlisting mercenaries for her army to defend the Northern Territories. Richard arrived there near the end of 1460 and positioned his troops close to the Lancastrian encampment. Following the Christmas festivities, on December 30th, York inexplicably departed the castle and headed towards Wakefield, where he encountered an enemy contingent twice the size of his own. Historical accounts offer various potential reasons for Richard's action, including his possible fear of being besieged, a failure of his intelligence network, or Margaret of Anjou's successful deception of him. Shortly before the engagement, a contingent of Lancastrian soldiers approached York under the pretense of being Allied forces and launched a surprise assault from the rear. York's army was vanquished, and the Duke himself perished in the confrontation. Following Richard York's demise, his Confederates rapidly began to shift their loyalty towards the Queen. Richard Neville, the younger Earl of Warwick, attempted to resist, but was defeated at the Second Battle of St. Albans. After this battle, the young Prince Edward gained infamy for ordering the execution of captured combatants. In the future, Prince Edward would become recognized for his cruelty, sadism, and a tendency to execute his subjects. Richard York's son, also named Edward, was leading troops in Wales during this period. Upon receiving news of his father's death, he committed himself to seeking retribution. Historical records indicate that when the young York paraded his soldiers, 3 celestial bodies appeared in the sky. This was interpreted as a favorable sign, and the soldiers eagerly marched forward. Initially, Edward subdued local Lancastrian loyalists, capturing their commander, Owen Tudor, whom he then executed. Subsequently, York advanced into England, joined forces with the younger Neville, and reached London ahead of the Lancastrian army, which had been delayed by plundering activities following their triumph at St. Albans. The inhabitants of London, unaware of the Lancastrian troops' current movements, willingly opened their gates to Edward York on the condition that he would shield them from the Lancasters. Parliament officially declared Edward York as King of England, Edward IV. The Lancasters retreated once more towards the north. Edward IV set out to reclaim his family's ancestral lands and encountered the Lancastrian army near Towton. Certain historical accounts exaggerate the number of combatants present on the battlefield, claiming figures as high as 100,000, and similarly inflate the casualty counts. Nevertheless, the Battle of Towton was indeed one of the most devastating engagements of this war. Edward's forces possessed a superior number of knights and cavalry, enabling them to swiftly drive the opposing forces into retreat. They pursued and eliminated the majority of the soldiers within the Lancastrian army. Queen Margaret and her son fled the country. Henry VI sought refuge in religious institutions for a period, but he was eventually apprehended and confined to the Tower. In England, apart from a few minor Lancastrian rebellions, for a period, Henry VI sought refuge within religious sanctuaries. However, his evasion proved temporary. He was ultimately apprehended and confined to the Tower. Throughout England, aside from isolated, minor demonstrations of Lancastrian descent, peace lasted for decades after Henry Beaufort's demise. The Earl of Warwick was the one to shatter this calm. Throughout Edward IV's rule, Warwick amassed wealth and power, becoming the most influential lord. He held many significant roles and brokered marriages between his daughters and the king's younger brothers, namely George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The Earl of Warwick experienced deep dissatisfaction with the king when Edward IV secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville. As the king began disregarding Warwick's counsel on international affairs, severe disagreements emerged between them. When Edward declined to have his brother wed Warwick's daughter, the Earl incited a revolt, defeated the king, and took him captive. Ultimately, Warwick made amends with the king, only to depart England a year later and form an alliance with Margaret of Anjou. Joining the Earl of Warwick, the king's brother George also traveled to France. The plotters, with French backing, disembarked in England and encircled the Yorkist troops. Edward IV was forced to depart the country. Henry VI was released from the Tower and once again declared king, while the Earl of Warwick effectively assumed control. For these contributions, his contemporaries bestowed upon him the title Kingmaker. A year later, Edward IV, aided by the Burgundians, made his return to his native land. During the Battle of Barnet, he triumphed over Warwick, and then set off to pursue Edmund Beaufort the Younger, who was accompanying Queen Margaret and Prince Edward. Encountering them at Tewkesbury, King Edward IV achieved victory over the Lancastrian forces. Beaufort and Prince Edward met their end after the conflict, while the Queen remained imprisoned until ransomed by the French king. Shortly thereafter, the former King Henry VI passed away. Most historical accounts suggest he was assassinated. Under Edward IV's command, the nation then enjoyed another 10 years of quiet. During this period, England saw only a brief interruption from a minor uprising led by the Earl of Oxford, a brief conflict with the French that proved fruitless, and a scheme orchestrated by the king's brother, George, Duke of Clarence. The plot was exposed, leading to the Duke's execution. Tradition claims he was submerged in a wine barrel. However, this era of peace concluded with the death of King Edward IV in 1483. His son, Edward V, ascended to the throne at the age of 12, but never received a coronation. Richard of Gloucester, the young king's uncle from the York lineage, assumed the role of Lord Protector and soon sought to legitimize Edward IV's children. The justification for this was his secret union with Elizabeth Woodville, and an alleged prior engagement of the king to another woman. Following this, Duke Richard was crowned King Richard I of England, while Edward and his younger sibling Richard became confined in the Tower, and subsequently vanished from historical records. The ultimate fate of the princes remains unknown. This matter became a political issue, as if Richard Mai had killed them. He would be perceived as a cruel ruler who unjustly seized the throne from his nephew, thus rendering Henry Tudor's actions a justified response to tyranny. Conversely, if Richard II bore no responsibility for the princes' deaths, then Henry Tudor would be considered a pretender who deposed a rightful king. At that time, Henry Tudor resided in Brittany. The Tudors were a distinguished Welsh family tracing their lineage to the semi-mythical kings of Gwynedd. Henry's father, Edmund Tudor, was King Henry VI's half-brother. Furthermore, Henry's mother was a member of the Beaufort family, establishing him as the closest claimant to the defunct Lancaster line. he began gathering supporters around him. And after Richard I ascended the English throne, he received clandestine backing from Elizabeth, Edward IV's widow, who even pledged her daughter's hand in marriage to him. During those years, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, revolted against Richard I. The reasons for this are unclear, as Henry had previously been among the new king's staunchest allies. Henry Tudor reached out to Stafford, intending to combine their forces to defeat Richard I together. Nevertheless, Richard I subdued Stafford before Tudor could reach England due to adverse weather conditions. Tudor's invasion concluded in defeat, yet he still departed Brittany, having become an unwelcome guest there. Tudor persisted in his preparations for conflict. He possessed an army and support from covert allies within England, but his primary assistance arrived from abroad. Girolamo Frescobaldi, a banker from Bruges representing financiers from that region, arrived to lend his support to Tudor. The core issue was that the Yorks had incurred substantial debts during the recent conflicts. They owed a considerable sum to the Medici Bank, which had recently relocated its operations from London to Bruges, amounting to 50,000 florins. Richard I had no intention of settling these obligations, feeling he was above such demands as the reigning king. Consequently, Frescobaldi provided financial backing to Tudor with the aim of helping him depose the king who owed the debt. With the acquired funds, Henry augmented his forces with 2,000 French mercenaries and obtained the era's innovative weaponry, specifically firearms. In 1485, he set sail for England leading an army of 5,000 troops. Tudor's contingent disembarked in Pembrokeshire, where they were immediately reinforced by Welsh units, who felt a stronger connection to the Tudors than to the Yorks. After securing control of Wales, Henry advanced into England. At this point, numerous minor nobles began to switch their allegiance to his cause. Meanwhile, Richard II was assembling his forces in Leicester. To guarantee the allegiance of his subordinates, he started taking their sons as hostages. While this practice was long-standing, it had become unpopular in recent times. Not long prior, Richard II's wife had passed away. Whispers rapidly circulated that Richard York had poisoned her to clear his path for marriage to his niece Elizabeth. The longer Henry remained in England, the diminishing Richard's prospects for victory became. Consequently, he resolved to confront Tudor directly. The two armies converged on Bosworth Field. Richard II's Yorkist contingent was numerically superior by 1.5 times and occupied the higher ground. Yet the day before the engagement, a prominent Yorkist follower, Thomas Stanley, who was Henry's stepfather, defected and assaulted the Yorkist positions. Richard II could not endure such a profound betrayal. He rallied a small contingent of devoted knights and charged into combat, intending to eliminate Henry. He came remarkably close to achieving this goal. Tudor's immediate retinue was devastated, and only the arrival of reinforcements saved Henry. Richard I was encircled and fell, becoming the final English king to perish in battle. Henry Tudor was then proclaimed the new sovereign. Henry V. The Wars of the Roses reached their conclusion, and apart from a few minor Yorkist uprisings, the Tudors brought an era of peace to England. This prolonged conflict stands as a defining moment in English history. Medieval England, which began the war with its lords and knights, concluded it with cannons and hired soldiers. The war inflicted a substantial blow upon feudal families. Some completely disappeared from the historical record, while others were so weakened they lost all political influence. In their place, a new influential class emerged, consisting of merchants, financiers, artisans, and other city dwellers. As a consequence of the war, Not only did the ruling dynasty change, but an entire historical period underwent a transformation.